A racist police officer arrested a black woman, but little did he know this was the most disastrous mistake he ever made. The summer afternoon draped Portland, Oregon in a golden haze, the Willamette River sparkling under a cloudless sky. The Riverside Park thrummed with life. Children's laughter echoed from the playground. Joggers pounded the winding trails and families sprawled on blankets beneath the sprawling branches of ancient firs. Olivia Brooks lay stretched out on a faded red picnic blanket, a thick legal tome propped against her knees. The faint scent of pine mingled with the earthy aroma of the riverbank, a rare moment of peace for the 38-year-old attorney whose days were typically swallowed by courtroom battles and late-night case files. Her dark curls fanned out around her, catching the sunlight, and her brown eyes skimmed the pages, lost in a world of precedents and statutes. A sharp screech of tires jolted her from her reverie. She glanced up, her brow furrowing as a police cruiser rolled to a stop along the curb, its lights flashing lazily. Two officers stepped out, James Riley, broad-shouldered with a buzz cut, and Mark Evans, leaner with a perpetual scowl. Their navy uniforms gleamed with authority, badges glinting in the sun. A few heads turned. Curious joggers slowed. A mother on a nearby bench glanced over, but the park's rhythm barely faltered. Olivia's gaze lingered on them, a flicker of unease stirring in her chest as their eyes swept the area and landed squarely on her. "Ma'am," Riley called, his voice carrying a brusque edge. "Can we have a word?" His tone wasn't a request. It was a command laced with suspicion. Olivia set her book down deliberately, her fingers brushing the worn spine, and sat up, smoothing her denim skirt. She met his stare with a calm she'd honed over years in hostile courtrooms. "Of course," she replied, her voice even, though her pulse quickened. She adjusted her posture, folding her hands in her lap, every movement measured. Evans stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel path, his hand resting casually, too casually, on his belt near his holster. "We got a call about someone who didn't belong around here," Evans said. His tone clipped, his gray eyes narrowing as they flicked over her book, her blanket, her very presence. "Mind telling us what you're up to?" Olivia raised an eyebrow, a spark of incredulity flashing through her. "Didn't belong?" she echoed, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "I'm reading. In a public park." She lifted the book, Constitutional Law, Cases and Commentary, its title bold against the cover, as if it could shield her from the absurdity of the question. Riley's lips pressed into a thin line. "Can we see some ID?" he demanded, ignoring her response. His hand hovered near his radio, his stance widening as if bracing for resistance. Her stomach tightened, a familiar anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. She'd faced scrutiny before, too many times, but never so blatantly unprovoked. "What's the reason for this?" she asked, her tone sharpening, though she kept it civil. "I'm not breaking any laws." "It's routine," Evans snapped, though his sneer suggested otherwise. "Just comply, and we'll be quick." The word routine landed like a slap, hollow and rehearsed. A small crowd began to gather. Teens on bikes paused. A man with a dog tilted his head. A young woman named Sarah pulled out her phone, her brow creased with unease. Whispers rippled through them, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Olivia sighed, forcing her frustration down, and reached into her canvas tote. She handed over her driver's license, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving theirs. "Olivia Brooks," Riley read aloud, his voice laced with mockery as he studied the card. "What's your business here, Ms. Brooks?" Her jaw clenched, but she kept her composure. "I live in Portland," she said, her words crisp. "I came to enjoy the park. Is that a crime now?" Evans smirked, handing the ID back with a flick of his wrist. "We'll see." He didn't step away. Instead, they lingered, their shadows stretching over her blanket. "You always carry books like that around?" Riley asked, nodding at the tome with a scoff. "Looks suspicious." "Are you alone or meeting someone?" Evans added, his hand still near his belt, his posture a silent threat. The questions weren't routine. They were a fishing expedition, each one digging deeper into her patience. Olivia's chest burned with indignation, but years of legal battles had taught her restraint. She straightened, meeting their gazes head-on. "I'm not answering unless you tell me what I'm accused of," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the warm air like a blade. Riley's face darkened. Don't get smart with us, he snapped, stepping closer, his bulk looming over her. We're doing our job. And I know the law, she countered, unflinching. I'm not breaking it by sitting here. Her heart pounded, but her words were steady, a shield against their aggression. Reason didn't sway them. Riley grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. You're resisting, he barked, though she hadn't moved an inch. Olivia's breath hitched, shock mingling with fury. What are you doing? She exclaimed, her voice rising as Evans pulled out handcuffs. The metal gleamed coldly as he stepped forward. Stop resisting, Evans shouted, louder now, a performance for the growing crowd. Sarah's phone stayed trained on them, her hands trembling slightly, while others murmured in protest. A man yelled, She's not doing anything. But the officers ignored them. The cuffs snapped around Olivia's wrists, biting into her skin, and humiliation surged through her, hot and bitter. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, even as her dignity was stripped away in broad daylight. They yanked her to her feet, her book tumbling onto the blanket, pages fluttering in the breeze. Let's go, Riley growled, leading her toward the cruiser. Olivia's legs moved mechanically, her mind racing. She glanced back at Sarah, their eyes locking for a fleeting second, a silent plea amid the chaos. Sarah nodded, her jaw set, the phone still recording. The cruiser door slammed shut, the sound echoing in her ears as she sank into the back seat. Her wrists throbbed, her blanket and book abandoned on the grass like relics of a stolen moment. The officers climbed in, Riley muttering something under his breath, Evans smirking through the rearview mirror. The car lurched forward, leaving the park behind, but Olivia's anger burned brighter with every passing second. She stared out the window, the river's shimmer blurring past, her reflection a ghost against the glass. She'd spent her career fighting for justice, defending the voiceless, yet here she was, handcuffed, powerless, a victim of the same system she'd sworn to uphold. The irony stung, but beneath it, a resolve hardened. This wasn't over. It was the spark of something bigger, something she'd fight with every ounce of her strength. As the cruiser rolled toward the station, Olivia Brooks vowed silently they'd face her again, and next time, she'd be the one in control. The holding cell in the Portland police station was a stark contrast to the sunlit park. A gray box with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint tang of bleach in the air. Olivia Brooks sat on the cold metal bench, her wrists still raw from the handcuffs, her denim skirt creased and grass-stained. The buzz of the lights drilled into her skull, but her mind was sharper than ever, replaying the arrest with forensic precision. James Riley's sneer, Mark Evans's deliberate intimidation, the crowd's murmurs. Every detail fueled the fire simmering in her chest. She clasped her hands tightly, her nails digging into her palms, forcing herself to channel the humiliation into strategy. Hours crawled by before the cell door clanked open. A young officer handed her a clipboard, his voice flat. Olivia Brooks, you're charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Bail's set. She stared at him, her brown eyes narrowing. On what grounds? She demanded, her tone edged with controlled fury. He shrugged, already turning away. Take it up in court. The cool night air hit her like a lifeline as she stepped out of the station, her tote bag slung over her shoulder. Tanya Phillips waited by the curb, her short braids glinting under the streetlights, her face a storm of relief and worry. Liv, she called, rushing forward, her sneakers scuffing the pavement. Are you okay? Olivia nodded, though her body trembled faintly, adrenaline still coursing through her. I'm fine, she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. Tanya's eyes softened, but she didn't push. In the car, Tanya gripped the wheel, glancing at Olivia as they pulled away. Silence stretched taut between them until Olivia spoke, her voice low and resolute. I'm not letting this go, Tanya. Not this time. Tanya's jaw tightened, a flicker of pride crossing her face. What's the plan? I'm suing them, Olivia said, her words slicing through the quiet. Riley, Evans, the whole department. This ends now. Tanya exhaled, nodding. Good, let's make it hurt. The next morning, Olivia sat at her cluttered dining table, legal pads and coffee mugs scattered around her laptop. The video Sarah had recorded, grainy but damning, played on a loop. Riley's grip on her arm, Evans's barked orders, her own calm defiance. It had gone viral overnight, shared across Portland and beyond. Hashtags like number Justice for Olivia trending on X. Her phone buzzed incessantly, support from strangers, colleagues, even a local activist group, but she ignored it, her focus razor sharp. Tanya arrived with breakfast burritos, her presence a steady anchor as they drafted the civil rights lawsuit. They'll claim you provoked them, Tanya warned, her pen tapping the table. Olivia smirked faintly. Let them try. That video says otherwise. The community response was electric. At a downtown cafe, a barista named Jamal slipped her a free coffee, whispering, You're a badass. Ms. Brooks. At the grocery store, an elderly woman squeezed her hand, eyes wet. Keep fighting? Honey. The support buoyed her, but it also weighed heavy. Every nod, every thank you, a reminder of the stakes. She wasn't just Olivia anymore. She was a symbol, and failure wasn't an option. Months later, the lawsuit loomed, but fate dealt an unexpected card. Olivia's firm buzzed with routine chaos when her assistant, Priya, poked her head in. You've been assigned a judicial rotation, she said, handing over a file. Misconduct hearing, next month. Olivia skimmed the details, her breath catching as two names leaped out. James Riley and Mark Evans. She leaned back, a disbelieving laugh escaping her. You've got to be kidding me. The hearing stemmed from a different incident. A peaceful environmental protest turned ugly when Riley and Evans roughed up a demonstrator named Ethan Carter. Tanya grinned when Olivia told her. Karma's got a sense of humor, she said, but Olivia's mind raced. Could she stay impartial? She'd spent weeks imagining facing them as a plaintiff, not a judge. Yet the irony fueled her. She'd turned their own game against them, fair and square. The courtroom in Portland's county courthouse was a quiet hum of anticipation, its high ceilings and oak paneling steeped in solemnity. Olivia stepped from the judge's chambers, her black robe flowing, her expression a mask of calm authority. The room stilled as she took the bench, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Lawyers, reporters, a handful of activists clutching signs. Then she saw them. Riley and Evans, seated at the defense table in crisp uniforms, their faces smug with routine confidence, until they recognized her. Riley's jaw dropped, color draining from his ruddy cheeks. Evans froze, his scowl morphing into wide-eyed shock, his hand twitching toward his collar, as if to adjust a tie that wasn't there. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Someone gasped, That's her! But Olivia's voice cut through, steady and commanding. This court is now in session. Please be seated. The officers sat rigid, their composure crumbling. Riley muttered something to their lawyer, a wiry man named Greg Larson, who nodded but kept his eyes on Olivia. She felt a surge of power, not vengeance, but control. She'd play this by the book, let the evidence speak. But their unease was a quiet victory she couldn't ignore. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lisa Nguyen, opened with precision. Your Honor, officers Riley and Evans are accused of excessive force during a lawful protest on June 12th. They assaulted Ethan Carter, an unarmed civilian without provocation. She clicked a remote, and grainy footage filled a screen. Riley slamming Ethan to the pavement, Evans barking orders, the crowd's shouts of outrage. Olivia's pen moved across her notepad, her face unreadable, though her stomach churned with echoes of her own arrest. Ethan took the stand, his wiry frame hunched, his voice trembling but firm. I was holding a sign, chanting with everyone else, he said, his hazel eyes darting to the officers. They didn't warn me, just grabbed me, threw me down. My head hit the ground so hard I saw stars. Olivia listened, her chest tightening. She'd felt that same helplessness, that same violation. Larson rose for the defense, his tone smooth but strained. Your Honor, the situation was chaotic. My clients acted to maintain order. Mr. Carter's behavior escalated tensions. He gestured vaguely, but Ethan shook his head during cross-examination. I didn't resist, he insisted, his voice rising. They didn't even give me a chance. Olivia's gaze flickered to Riley and Evans. Riley avoided her eyes, his fingers tapping nervously, while Evans stared ahead, his jaw clenched. She saw their tension, their cracks, men who'd wielded power without thought, now squirming under her scrutiny. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she buried it beneath duty. This wasn't about her, it was about Ethan, about justice. As the day wore on, the evidence piled up. Witnesses, video, A paramedic's report on Ethan's concussion. Olivia adjourned with a crisp. "We'll resume tomorrow," her gavel a punctuation mark. Riley and Evans lingered as the room emptied, their heads bent in hushed argument, their lawyer whispering fiercely. She caught Riley's glance, brief, uncertain, almost regretful, and felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Not pity, not yet, but a recognition of the stakes. Tomorrow she'd decide their fate, and with it, her own place in this tangled fight. The Portland courthouse brimmed with tension the next morning, its oak-paneled walls absorbing the murmur of a packed gallery. Word of Olivia Brooks presiding over the officers who'd arrested her had spread like wildfire, drawing a motley crowd, reporters scribbling in notebooks, activists clutching flyers, and curious locals craning for a glimpse. Olivia stepped onto the bench, her black robe a mantle of authority, her expression serene yet resolute. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows, but her presence softened the room's edges, a quiet force that silenced the hum as she settled into her chair. Her brown eyes swept the space, landing briefly on James Riley and Mark Evans at the defense table. Their uniforms couldn't mask their unease. Riley's shoulders hunched, Evans's jaw tight, both avoiding her gaze. The prosecutor, Lisa Nguyen, resumed with a steely edge. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Officers Riley and Evans used excessive force against Ethan Carter, an unarmed protester exercising his rights. This wasn't a lapse. It's a pattern of disregard." She played more footage, the crack of Ethan's body hitting pavement echoing through the speakers, gasps rippling from the crowd. Olivia's pen scratched across her notepad, her face a mask, though her stomach twisted with echoes of her own ordeal. Riley's grip, Evans's sneer, the cold bite of cuffs. Greg Larson stood for the defense, his voice smooth but faltering. "Your Honor, my clients acted under pressure. The protest was volatile, mistakes were made, but not malice." His words hung thin, undercut by Ethan's testimony the day before, unwavering under cross-examination. Olivia listened, her mind sifting facts from excuses. Her own arrest a shadow she pushed aside. She had to be impartial, even if their justifications rang hollow, eerily familiar. Riley took the stand, his buzz-cut head gleaming under the lights, his voice shaky as he swore in. Lisa pressed him. "You tackled Mr. Carter without warning. Why?" Riley shifted, glancing at Evans. "I thought he was a threat," he mumbled. "It happened fast." Olivia's pen paused, her chest tightening. "A threat? Like she'd been reading on a blanket?" "Did he resist?" Lisa asked. Riley hesitated, his silence damning. Not really," he admitted, his eyes dropping. Evans followed, his scowl softer now, his tone defensive. "We were keeping order," he insisted, but his hands fidgeted, betraying his bravado. Lisa's cross-examination was relentless. "Order doesn't mean violence," and Evans stumbled, his answers fraying. Olivia watched, her heart a tangle of frustration and resolve. These men had power, yet wielded it like a blunt weapon, careless of the wreckage. The closing arguments sealed it. Lisa's voice rose, fervent. "This court must send a message. Abuse of authority has consequences." Larson's rebuttal was feeble, a plea for leniency that lacked conviction. Olivia adjourned for deliberation, her gavel striking with a finality that hung in the air. Riley and Evans exchanged a glance, Riley's face pale, Evans' eyes darting, as the room emptied. Olivia lingered, gathering her notes, feeling their stares like weights. She met Riley's gaze for a split second. Regret flickered there, faint but real, and turned away, duty calling her forward. A week later, the courtroom swelled again, the air thick with anticipation. Olivia entered, her robe flowing, her steps steady despite the knot in her chest. Cameras flashed from the back, reporters poised, but she focused on the task ahead. "This court delivers its ruling," she began, her voice clear, cutting through the hush. "Officers Riley and Evans are entrusted to protect, not harm. Their actions on June 12th violated that trust." She paused, letting the words settle. Riley stared at his hands, Evans at the floor. "The evidence, video, testimony, medical reports, shows excessive force without justification. This isn't isolated. It reflects a need for accountability." Her tone hardened, though her heart ached. Not for them, but for Ethan, for herself, for every unheard voice. I order a 6-month suspension without pay, mandatory retraining on de-escalation and bias, and a permanent disciplinary mark on their records. The gavel fell, a crisp echo. Murmurs erupted, approval from some, shock from others. Riley's head dropped. Evan's fists clenched, but they rose silently, their lawyer ushering them out. A reporter called, "Judge Brooks!" A statement. She shook her head, retreating to her chambers, the weight of her robe heavier now. Justice was served, but it felt incomplete, a single thread in a tangled web. That evening, Olivia attended a community forum at a recreation center near the river. The room buzzed with voices, young activists, weary parents, a retired cop named Henry who nodded as she spoke. "We need transparency," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Accountability isn't punishment, it's progress." A woman named Maria gripped her hand after, tears in her eyes. "My son went through the same." "Thank you," Olivia's throat tightened, her smile faint. "We're just starting." The next day, she visited Portland State University, invited by a law professor friend, Dr. Karen Ellis. Students packed the lecture hall, their faces eager, some holding phones to record. "I didn't plan to be here," Olivia admitted, standing at the podium, her suit sharp against the whiteboard. "But when those officers cuffed me, I saw the system's cracks. We fix it by speaking up, every time." A student, Jamal, raised his hand. "How do you keep going?" She paused, then smiled. "Because silence isn't an option." Weeks later, standing by the Willamette, Olivia watched the river flow, its surface rippling under a crisp autumn sky. The lawsuit against Riley Evans and the department was still pending, but the hearing's ripple effect had begun. Community boards met with police. Activists pushed for body cams. A local paper ran Ethan's story. She hadn't seen the officers since, but rumors swirled. Riley had apologized to Ethan through a mediator, a small step she noted without celebration. Change was slow, she knew, but tangible. Her phone buzzed. Tanya with a photo of a protest sign, "Brooks for Justice." Olivia chuckled, a rare lightness lifting her chest. She wasn't alone in this fight. The voices she'd amplified now carried her forward. As joggers passed and ducks bobbed on the water, she felt a quiet hope. Not victory, not yet, but possibility. The system wasn't perfect, but it could bend, pushed by those who refused to break. Back home, she sat with Tanya over coffee, the lawsuit draft between them. "You're a force, Liv," Tanya said, her eyes bright. Olivia shrugged, sipping her mug. "Just a lawyer who got mad." Tanya laughed, but her gaze held respect. "No, you're more. Portland's waking up because of you." Olivia leaned back, the river's calm echoing in her mind. She hadn't sought this role, judge, symbol, advocate, but it found her, forged in that unjust arrest, tempered by her ruling. Every step forward, every voice raised was worth it. Justice wasn't a finish line, it was a path, and she'd walk it, one case, one truth at a time. As Olivia stood by the Willamette, the river's steady flow mirrored her resolve, a quiet strength born from that unjust day in the park. Her story isn't just about one woman facing down two officers. It's a testament to the power of standing up, of turning pain into purpose. From a blanket on the grass to a judge's bench, she showed us justice isn't given. It's fought for, step by stubborn step. Isn't that inspiring? It makes you wonder, what could we change if we refuse to stay silent? Thank you so much for listening to Olivia's journey. It's been a privilege to share it with you. If it stirred something in you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that spark thought and heart. Drop a comment below. Did her fight resonate with you? Have you seen justice rise from unexpected places? We'd love to hear your take. Thanks again and see you next time. Stay bold.